30 hillbilly sandwiches from Appalachian kitchens in the 1970s, so shameful your mother made you eat them in the car before school, ones that announced your family was broke the second someone saw them, kept kids fed when payday was 4 days away, and the cupboard held nothing but condiments, saltine crackers and butter, bacon grease sandwiches, vinegar on stale Wonder Bread.
We didn't have much back then. Sometimes just butter and crackers.
Your grandmother made these for under a quarter and swallowed her pride so they could survive. Today, those children lie about what they ate, pretend they never knew this hunger. These vanished when America decided poverty only happened to people who deserved it. We're dragging them back because erasing survival doesn't erase suffering. Here's number 1. Bread and gravy sandwich, when leftover gravy was the only filling. This was white bread with cold sausage gravy spooned between 2 slices. In 1970, this cost about 3 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 25 cents today. The gravy was left over from breakfast, made from sausage drippings, flour, and milk. By lunchtime, it had congealed into a thick, fatty paste. You'd spread it on bread like peanut butter. The cold gravy was greasy and heavy, but it provided calories and fat. Some families reheated the gravy first if they had fuel to spare. Most ate it cold. This sandwich disappeared when people stopped making gravy from scratch every morning. You can make it for about 30 cents today. Saltine and butter sandwich, when bread ran out before payday. This was saltine crackers with butter spread on them, stacked between 2 more crackers. In 1970, this cost about 2 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 20 cents today. A box of saltines cost 20 cents and lasted for weeks. When the bread was gone, you used crackers. The butter made them less dry. You'd press 4 crackers together, 2 buttered crackers in the middle, 2 plain crackers on the outside. The result was salty, crunchy, and barely held together. Kids hated these because crackers weren't real sandwiches. Saltine sandwiches disappeared when running out of bread became unacceptable. You can make them for about 25 cents today. Flour gravy on bread, when there was no meat for gravy. This was white bread with flour gravy made without any meat drippings. In 1970, this cost about 2 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 20 cents today. Flour gravy was made by browning flour in lard or butter, then adding milk and salt. It had no meat flavor, just the taste of toasted flour and fat. You'd pour it over bread and eat it with a fork, or let it cool and spread it like paste. This was calories when there was nothing else. Flour gravy sandwiches disappeared when they became too embarrassing to admit. You can make them for about 25 cents today. Cornbread and buttermilk sandwich, when cornbread was cheaper than bread. This was a piece of cornbread split open and soaked in buttermilk. In 1970, this cost about 3 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 25 cents today. Cornmeal was cheaper than wheat flour. A bag cost 30 cents and made dozens of batches. Buttermilk was cheap at 25 cents per quart. You'd crumble cornbread into a bowl, pour buttermilk over it, and eat it with a spoon. Some families pressed it between 2 pieces of cornbread to make it more sandwich-like. This was filling and tasted tangy from the buttermilk. These disappeared when cornbread became associated with rural poverty. You can make them for about 30 cents today. Bacon grease sandwich, when the bacon was gone, but the grease remained. This was white bread spread with bacon grease and sprinkled with salt. In 1970, this cost about 1 cent per sandwich. That's roughly 10 cents today. Every family kept a can of bacon grease by the stove. It was cooking fat, flavoring, and emergency sandwich filling. When there was no bacon left, you used the grease. It was white and solid at room temperature. You'd spread it like butter. The bacon flavor was faint but present. Salt made it taste like something. Bacon grease sandwiches disappeared when people stopped saving bacon grease. You can still make them for about 15 cents today if you save your grease. 5 sandwiches down, 25 to go. And you're already seeing it. Every single one was desperation. Every single one cost under 5 cents in 1970. Every single one disappeared when people had enough money to forget they'd ever been this poor. But here's where it gets harder. The next 5 sandwiches are even more desperate. These are what you ate when the bacon grease ran out, when there was nothing in the house except flour and water. If you've never been that poor, you're lucky. Let's keep going. Water biscuit sandwich, when there was no buttermilk for proper biscuits. This was a biscuit made with flour, lard, salt, and water. No buttermilk, no milk. In 1970, this cost about 2 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 20 cents today. When the buttermilk ran out, you made biscuits with water. They were dense, hard, and flavorless. You'd split them and add whatever you had, lard, bacon grease, or just salt. These biscuits were survival food, not real biscuits. Water biscuit sandwiches disappeared when people could always afford buttermilk. You can make them for about 25 cents today. Molasses bread, when sugar was too expensive. This was white bread with molasses spread on it. In 1970, this cost about 3 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 25 cents today. Molasses was cheaper than sugar. A jar cost 40 cents and lasted for months. It was thick, dark, and intensely sweet. You'd spread it thin because too much was overwhelming. The molasses soaked into the bread and made it sticky and dark. You can make it for about 30 cents today. Cracker and lard sandwich, when butter was too expensive. This was saltine crackers with lard spread on them. In 1970, this cost about 2 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 20 cents today. Lard was cheaper than butter, 40 cents per can versus 70 cents per pound. When butter ran out, you used lard. It was white, soft, and flavorless. You'd spread it on crackers and sprinkle salt on top. These disappeared when lard became taboo. You can make them for about 25 cents today. Vinegar bread, when there was nothing else to add flavor. This was white bread sprinkled with vinegar and salt. In 1970, this cost about 1 cent per sandwich. That's roughly 10 cents today. Vinegar was cheap. A bottle cost 20 cents and lasted forever. You'd sprinkle it on bread like you were seasoning food. The vinegar soaked in and made the bread tangy and wet. Salt made it taste less terrible. Kids hated these. Vinegar bread disappeared because nobody wants to admit they ate it. You can make it for about 15 cents today. Potato sandwich, when potatoes were cheaper than meat. This was white bread with cold mashed potatoes spread between slices. In 1970, this cost about 4 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 30 cents today. Potatoes were cheap. A 5-pound bag cost 30 cents. When there were leftover mashed potatoes from dinner, you'd use them for lunch. The potatoes were cold, thick, and bland. Some families added salt and pepper. Others added butter if they had it. This was starch on starch, filling but monotonous. Potato sandwiches never fully disappeared. They're still eaten in some places. You can make them for about 35 cents today. 10 sandwiches down, 20 to go. And here's what you're noticing. These aren't creative solutions anymore. These are last resorts. When you're eating vinegar on bread, you're not making do. You're barely surviving. The next 10 sandwiches show what happened when families got slightly more resources. Not much more, but enough to add one ingredient, one small improvement. Let's keep going. Oatmeal sandwich, when leftover oatmeal became lunch. This was white bread with cold leftover oatmeal spread between slices. In 1970, this cost about 3 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 25 cents today. Oatmeal was cheap. A container cost 40 cents and made dozens of servings. The oatmeal was thick, sticky, and bland. This was filling and provided some nutrition. Oatmeal sandwiches disappeared when they became too embarrassing. You can make them for about 30 cents today. Syrup and bread sandwich, when even butter was too expensive. This was white bread with pancake syrup drizzled on it, folded in half. In 1970, this cost about 3 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 25 cents today. You'd drizzle it on bread and fold it quickly before it dripped. The syrup soaked in and made the bread sweet and soggy. This was sugar and carbohydrates, pure energy. Syrup sandwiches disappeared when people could afford better. You can make them for about 30 cents today. Cheese and crackers, sandwich, when bread and cheese felt too wasteful. This was government cheese between saltine crackers. In 1970, this cost about 4 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 30 cents today. Government cheese was free, distributed through welfare programs. A 5-pound block lasted for weeks. You'd slice it thin and place it between crackers. The cheese was orange, rubbery, and salty. The crackers were dry and crumbly. Together, they made something that resembled a sandwich. These disappeared when government cheese programs changed. You can make them with store-bought cheese for about 35 cents today. Bread and milk soup sandwich, when soup was just bread soaked in milk. This was white bread torn into pieces and soaked in milk, eaten with a spoon. In 1970, this cost about 4 cents per serving. That's roughly 30 cents today. When there was nothing else, you made bread soup. Tear bread into a bowl. Pour milk over it. Add sugar if you had it. Let it soak until the bread was soft. This was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what else was available. Bread soup disappeared when people could afford real food. You can make it for about 35 cents today. Coffee bread, when coffee was breakfast and lunch. This was white bread soaked in leftover coffee with sugar. In 1970, this cost about 2 cents per serving. That's roughly 20 cents today. When there was nothing else, you used leftover morning coffee. Pour it in a bowl. Add sugar if you had it. Tear bread into pieces and soak them. Eat with a spoon. The bread absorbed the coffee and became soft and bittersweet. This was caffeine and carbohydrates. Coffee bread disappeared when people could afford real breakfast. You can make it for about 25 cents today. Rehook 15 sandwiches down, 15 to go, and we're entering different territory now. The sandwiches that showed small improvements. These are what you ate when your family had slightly more money, when the pantry had a few more items. These sandwiches had 2 ingredients instead of 1. They had flavor instead of just calories. They were still poverty food, but they were better poverty food. Let's finish strong. Fatback sandwich, when salt pork was all the meat you had. This was white bread with thin slices of fried fatback, salt-cured pork fat. In 1970, this cost about 8 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 65 cents today. Fatback was cheap, 30 cents per pound at the butcher. You'd slice it thin and fry it until the fat rendered out and the edges crisped. Place the hot fat back on bread. The grease would soak into the bread. This was pure fat and salt, intense flavor, massive calories. Fatback sandwiches disappeared when salt pork became associated with rural poverty. You can make them for about 70 cents today. Rendered chicken fat sandwich, when chicken fat was saved like gold. This was white bread spread with schmaltz, rendered chicken fat. In 1970, this cost about 1 cent per sandwich. That's roughly 10 cents today. Every time you cooked chicken, you saved the fat. It would solidify in a jar by the stove. When there was nothing else, you spread it on bread like butter. Add salt, and it tasted rich and chickeny. This was Jewish poverty food that crossed into general working-class kitchens. Schmaltz sandwiches disappeared when people stopped saving cooking fat. You can make them for about 15 cents today if you render your own fat. Tuna fish sandwich, when one had to feed 4 people. This was white bread with tuna fish stretched with mayonnaise. In 1970, this cost about 8 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 65 cents today. A can of tuna cost 40 cents and was supposed to make 2 sandwiches. Poor families made it make 4 by adding lots of mayonnaise. The tuna was pale and watery. The mayonnaise made it spreadable. This was fish when fish was expensive. Tuna sandwiches never disappeared, but the stretched version did. You can make them for about 70 cents today. Egg salad sandwich, when eggs were the cheapest protein. This was white bread with mashed hard-boiled eggs mixed with mayonnaise and salt. In 1970, this cost about 6 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 50 cents today. Eggs were cheap protein, 50 cents per dozen. One egg made one sandwich. You'd boil the egg, mash it with a fork, mix in mayonnaise and salt. The result was lumpy and bland, but filling. Egg salad sandwiches never disappeared. They became deli food. You can make them for about 55 cents today. Butter and salt sandwich, when butter was all you had. This was white bread with butter and salt, nothing else. In 1970, this cost about 4 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 30 cents today. When there was no jelly, no sugar, no other topping, there was butter and salt. The butter made the bread less dry. The salt made it taste like something. This was fat and sodium, basic fuel. Butter and salt sandwiches disappeared when they became too simple to admit. You can make them for about 35 cents today. Peanut butter sandwich. No jelly, just peanut butter. This was white bread with peanut butter and nothing else. In 1970, this cost about 5 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 40 cents today. Peanut butter was protein, 65 cents per jar. When there was no jelly, you ate it plain. The peanut butter was thick and sticky. It stuck to the roof of your mouth. You needed water to wash it down. Kids ate these and wished for jelly. Plain peanut butter sandwiches disappeared when jelly became affordable. You can make them for about 45 cents today. Lunch, meat sandwich, the cheapest lunch meat available. This was white bread with olive loaf or pickle loaf, the cheapest lunch meats. In 1970, this cost about 12 cents per sandwich. That's roughly $1 today. These lunch meats cost 40 cents per pound versus bologna at 50 cents. They had chunks of olives or pickles mixed into mystery meat. You'd eat them with mustard to mask the flavor. This was meat when better meat was too expensive. These lunch meats disappeared when people could afford bologna. You can make them for about $1.10 today. Condensed milk sandwich, when canned milk was cheaper than fresh. This was white bread with sweetened condensed milk drizzled on top. In 1970, this cost about 6 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 50 cents today. A can of condensed milk cost 40 cents and lasted for weeks. You'd open the can and drizzle a spoonful on bread. The milk was thick, sweet, and sticky. It soaked into the bread and made it dessert sweet. This was sugar and dairy when fresh milk was too expensive. Condensed milk sandwiches disappeared when fresh milk became affordable. You can make them for about 55 cents today. Leftover rice sandwich, when rice was cheaper than bread. This was white bread with cold leftover rice pressed between slices. In 1970, this cost about 4 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 30 cents today. Rice was cheap. A bag cost 50 cents and lasted for weeks. When there was leftover rice from dinner, you'd use it for lunch. The rice was cold, sticky, and bland. Some families added soy sauce or salt. Others added butter if they had it. This was starch on starch. Rice sandwiches disappeared when they became too strange to admit. You can make them for about 35 cents today. Meat drippings. Sandwich, when the meat was gone, but drippings remained. This was white bread spread with congealed meat drippings from any cooked meat. In 1970, this cost about 1 cent per sandwich. That's roughly 10 cents today. Every family saved drippings in a can: beef fat, pork fat, chicken fat, whatever was left after cooking. When there was no meat, you used the drippings. They were brown, gelatinous, and intensely flavored. Spread them on bread. Add salt. The fat would soften from your body heat. Meat dripping sandwiches disappeared when saving drippings became old-fashioned. You can make them for about 15 cents today if you save drippings. But the drippings can tell its own story about poverty and resourcefulness. It sat on the stove or counter, usually an old coffee can or a metal container with a lid. After cooking any meat, you'd pour the pan drippings into this can. The fat would float to the top and solidify as it cooled, creating a seal that preserved the darker, more flavorful drippings underneath. This wasn't one type of fat. It was layers. Bacon grease from Sunday breakfast, pot roast drippings from Monday dinner, pork chop fat from Wednesday, chicken fat from Saturday. Each layer added flavor, creating a complex mixture that tasted like every meal you'd cooked that week. The drippings were stratified by color and texture. Beef fat was pale and hard when cold. Pork fat was white and softer. Chicken fat was yellow and almost creamy. The non-fat drippings at the bottom were dark brown, thick with dissolved proteins and caramelized bits from the pan. This bottom layer was pure, concentrated meat flavor, the essence of every roast, every chop, every piece of meat that had passed through your kitchen. Making a meat-dripping sandwich required scraping some of this mixture onto bread. The fat was solid and cold from the refrigerator or cool pantry. You'd use a butter knife to scrape off a chunk, maybe a tablespoon's worth. The fat would be firm and waxy, difficult to spread. You'd work it across the bread, leaving streaks and chunks. The bread would resist, tearing slightly under the pressure. Eventually, you'd get a rough coating of fat across the surface. Sprinkle salt on top. The salt was essential. It cut through the greasiness and enhanced the meat flavor. When you bit into it, the fat would begin to melt from your body heat. It would soften and spread across your tongue, coating your mouth with grease. The flavor was intensely meaty, not like eating meat, but like eating the ghost of meat. You could taste beef, pork, chicken all at once. The salt made it savory and almost addictive despite the texture. The bread absorbed some of the melting fat, becoming translucent and greasy. Each bite was rich and heavy, sitting in your stomach like a stone. This sandwich represented the absolute refusal to waste anything. The meat itself had been eaten days ago. These were the remnants, the fat and juices left in the pan after cooking. Most modern cooks pour this down the drain or throw it away. Poor families in the 1970s saved it religiously. That can of drippings represented every piece of meat they'd been able to afford. Wasting it would be wasting money they didn't have. So they saved it, used it for cooking, and when there was nothing else, spread it on bread and called it a meal. The shame around meat-dripping sandwiches was profound. This wasn't even real food. It was the residue of food. It was what was left after everything valuable had been consumed. Eating it meant you were so poor you couldn't afford the actual meat, couldn't even afford butter or lard, had to resort to scraping congealed fat from a can. Children who brought these to school would hide them, eat them quickly, hope nobody saw. The smell alone would give you away. That distinctive meaty, fatty odor that marked you as desperately poor. Meat drippings, sandwiches, disappeared when people stopped saving drippings entirely. Modern cooking uses less fat. Health warnings about animal fat made people afraid of it. Convenience made it easier to buy new cooking oil than save old fat. By the 1990s, the drippings can had vanished from most kitchens. Without that, can sitting on the stove, accumulating fat from every meal, you couldn't make these sandwiches. The practice died, and with it, this particular expression of poverty cooking, the kind that extracted value from what everyone else considered garbage. Re-hook, 25 sandwiches down, 5 to go. And here's what's remarkable about these last 5. They're the ones that show just how far desperation can push creativity. These aren't just cheap sandwiches anymore. These are meals made from things that shouldn't be meals. Cooking oil on bread, cornmeal mush fried and used instead of bread, canned milk soaked into torn pieces of white bread. If you think the first 25 were hard to imagine eating, wait until you see what your grandmother did when even those ingredients ran out. These final 5 are proof that hunger makes you inventive. Let's finish this. Lard and molasses sandwich when you needed sweet and fat together. This was white bread spread with lard, then drizzled with molasses. In 1970, this cost about 3 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 25 cents today. Lard provided fat and calories. Molasses provided sweetness and iron. Together they made something that tasted rich and complex. The molasses cut through the bland lard. Some families mixed them together first, others layered them. This was energy food when there was nothing else. Lard and molasses sandwiches disappeared when lard became taboo. You can make them for about 30 cents today, but this sandwich tells a deeper story about how poverty forces strange combinations that somehow work. And what poor families had in the 1970s was often lard and molasses. Both were cheap. Both lasted forever without refrigeration. Both provided calories when calories were scarce. The economics made sense, even if the combination seemed strange. A can of lard cost about 40 cents in 1970 and lasted for months. You used it for cooking, for greasing pans, for making biscuits, and when there was nothing else, for spreading on bread. Lard was pure fat, 9 calories per gram, the most calorie-dense food available. When you were poor, calories mattered more than taste. Lard delivered energy efficiently and cheaply. A jar of molasses cost about 50 cents and also lasted for months. Molasses was a byproduct of sugar refining, the syrup left over after sugar crystals were extracted. It was cheaper than sugar, lasted longer than sugar, and had more nutrients than sugar. It contained iron, calcium, potassium, and B vitamins. For families who couldn't afford meat or fresh vegetables, molasses provided trace nutrients that prevented deficiency diseases. Making a lard and molasses sandwich required deciding on your approach. Some families spread lard on bread first, then drizzled molasses over it. The lard would be soft at room temperature, spreadable like butter but greasier, leaving a slick film on the bread. The molasses would pool on top of the lard, thick and dark. When you bit into it, you'd taste fat first, then sweetness. The flavors hit separately, in waves. Other families mixed the lard and molasses together first, creating a spread that combined both. You'd scoop lard into a bowl, add molasses, and stir until they formed a uniform mixture, brown and glossy and strange-looking. This method distributed the flavors evenly. Every bite had fat and sweet together. The taste was surprisingly complex. Lard alone was bland and greasy, not unpleasant, but not interesting. Molasses alone was overwhelmingly sweet with a bitter, almost burnt edge. Together, they balanced each other. The fat mellowed the molasses' intensity. The molasses gave the lard flavor and purpose. The result tasted rich and satisfying in a way that neither ingredient did alone. It tasted like energy, like substance, like something that would keep you going through a long day of physical work or a long day of being hungry. The texture was the challenging part. Lard was slippery and coated your mouth. Molasses was sticky and clung to your teeth. Together, they created a sandwich that was simultaneously greasy and sticky. It wasn't pleasant. Children complained about the way it felt, the greasiness on their lips, the stickiness on their teeth, the way the bread became soggy from the molasses soaking in. But complaints didn't matter when there was nothing else to eat. You ate what you were given. You learned to tolerate textures you didn't like. You understood that food was fuel, not entertainment. Lard and molasses sandwiches were specifically working-class food, eaten by people who did physical labor. Farmers ate them. Factory workers ate them. Construction workers ate them. People who needed massive calorie intake to fuel their bodies through 10 or 12 hours of hard work. The fat and sugar provided quick energy and sustained energy. The sandwich was small and portable. You could wrap it in wax paper, put it in a lunch pail, and eat it during a break. It didn't need refrigeration. It didn't spoil in the heat. It was practical food for people whose lives were defined by physical labor and limited resources. There was also a regional dimension to this sandwich. It was more common in the South and in rural areas where lard was standard cooking fat and molasses was a staple sweetener. Northern urban families were more likely to use butter and sugar, but in the South, especially rural South, lard and molasses were what you had. They were traditional ingredients that had been used for generations. Your grandmother ate lard and molasses sandwiches. Her grandmother did too. This was heritage food, even if it was poverty food. That connection to the past gave it meaning beyond just calories. The nutritional profile was interesting. Lard provided fat-soluble vitamins A, D, and E. Molasses provided iron, calcium, and B vitamins. White bread provided carbohydrates and some B vitamins if it was enriched. Together, they made a meal that was calorie-dense and provided some micronutrients, not optimal nutrition. There were no vegetables, no complete proteins, no vitamin C, but better than eating nothing, better than eating just bread. The molasses especially mattered for preventing anemia. Iron deficiency was common among poor families who couldn't afford meat. Molasses provided enough iron to prevent the worst effects of deficiency. Children who ate lard and molasses sandwiches had complicated feelings about them. Some genuinely liked the taste. The sweetness appealed to kids, and the richness was satisfying. Others hated them but ate them anyway because they were hungry. As adults, those children often had strong reactions to lard and molasses. Some refused to have either in their homes. The association with poverty was too painful. Others sought them out, made the sandwiches for themselves occasionally, found comfort in the familiar taste. Food memories from childhood are powerful and persistent. The taste of lard and molasses could bring back entire worlds, kitchens where mothers stretched every penny, lunch pails carried to work before dawn, the feeling of being hungry and having this strange sandwich be the only thing available. The disappearance of lard and molasses sandwiches happened as lard became culturally taboo. By the 1980s, animal fats were blamed for heart disease. Vegetable oils were promoted as healthier alternatives. Lard went from standard cooking fat to something old-fashioned and dangerous. Younger generations stopped using it. Grocery stores stopped carrying it, or carried only small packages in obscure sections. Without lard in the house, you couldn't make lard and molasses sandwiches. The tradition died not because people stopped being poor, but because the ingredient became unavailable and socially unacceptable. Molasses also declined in popularity. White sugar became cheaper and more convenient. Corn syrup replaced molasses in many recipes. By the 1990s, molasses was something you bought once a year to make gingerbread cookies at Christmas. Nobody kept it in the pantry year-round. Nobody used it as an everyday sweetener. Without molasses readily available, the sandwich became impossible to make, even if you wanted to. But the sandwich represented something important about poverty cooking, the ability to combine unlikely ingredients and create something that worked. Lard and molasses shouldn't go together. They come from different culinary traditions, different flavor profiles, different purposes. But poverty doesn't care about culinary logic. Poverty cares about calories, cost, and availability. Lard and molasses were cheap, available, and calorie-dense, so people combined them, and the combination worked well enough to keep families fed through hard times. There's also something to be said for the honesty of this sandwich. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It was fat and sugar on bread. That's all it claimed to be. No fancy name, no elaborate preparation, no attempt to disguise what it was. Just lard and molasses, just survival, just making do with what you had. That honesty feels almost radical in modern food culture where everything is branded and marketed and positioned. This sandwich had no pretensions. It was poverty food, and everyone who ate it knew that. Crackers soaked in gravy when bread was too expensive. This was saltine crackers soaked in leftover gravy until soft, eaten with a fork. In 1970, this cost about 3 cents per serving. That's roughly 25 cents today. When bread ran out, you used crackers. When the gravy was too thin to spread, you soaked crackers in it. The crackers would absorb the gravy and become soft and mushy. This was eaten like cereal, in a bowl with a spoon. Cracker gravy disappeared disappeared when running out of bread became unacceptable. You can make it for about 30 cents today. But this dish reveals something crucial about poverty, the hierarchy of desperation. Running out of bread before payday meant you'd miscalculated. Bread was supposed to last. It was the foundation of cheap meals. When it was gone, you scrambled for substitutes. Crackers were the obvious choice. They were shelf-stable, cheap, and resembled bread enough to function as replacement. A box of saltines cost 20 cents and contained about 40 crackers. That was cheaper per serving than bread, but crackers weren't satisfying on their own. They were dry, salty, crumbly. You needed something to make them edible. Leftover gravy solved that problem. Every family that cooked meat saved the drippings and made gravy. Sausage gravy. When you needed to stretch a meal, you reheated that gravy. Add water if it was too thick. Add flour if it was too thin. The gravy became the vehicle for making crackers into a meal. The process was simple and sad. Crumble saltines into a bowl, not whole crackers, but broken pieces. Pour warm gravy over them. The gravy would soak into the crackers immediately. They'd soften and swell, absorbing the liquid like sponges. Stir it together. Wait a minute for the crackers to fully saturate. The result was a thick, lumpy mixture that looked like very bad oatmeal. The crackers would break down into mush. The gravy would bind everything together. The texture was somewhere between soup and paste. Eating it required a spoon or fork. You couldn't pick it up. It was too wet, too soft, too formless. You'd scoop it up and try not to think too hard about what you were eating. The taste depended entirely on the gravy. Sausage gravy made it savory and fatty. Brown gravy made it taste like meat, even though there was no meat. Chicken gravy made it lighter, but blander. Whatever the flavor, the texture was the problem. Mushy, slimy, falling apart in your mouth. Children hated the texture. Adults tolerated it because it was food, and food was necessary. This was eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on when you ran out of bread. It was filling in the way that starch and fat are filling. Heavy, sitting in your stomach, making you feel full even if you weren't satisfied. The salt from the crackers and the fat from the gravy provided flavor. The crackers provided bulk. Together they made something that counted as a meal, even if barely. The shame of eating crackers soaked in gravy was specific. It meant you'd run out of bread. Running out of bread meant poor planning or poverty so severe you couldn't afford to keep basic staples in the house. Either way, it marked you as failing at poverty, not managing your limited resources well enough to make it to payday with bread still available. Other poverty foods were understandable. This one suggested you couldn't even do poverty right. Children who ate this learned not to mention it. What did you have for breakfast? Cereal. It was technically true. It was eaten from a bowl with a spoon like cereal. But it wasn't cereal. It was crackers and gravy. And admitting that meant admitting your family was so poor you'd run out of bread. That admission carried weight. Other kids would remember. They'd tell their parents. Your family would be marked as the poorest of the poor. Crackers soaked in gravy disappeared as economic conditions improved, and bread became something families could afford to keep stocked. Running out of bread became unacceptable, a sign of mismanagement rather than inevitable poverty. By the 1990s, this dish had vanished completely. Nobody admits they ate it. Nobody wants to remember eating it. It's too embarrassing, too desperate, too revealing of just how poor some families were. But it existed. Thousands of families ate it, and remembering it matters, even if the memory is uncomfortable. Cooking oil and salt sandwich, when there was no solid fat. This was white bread drizzled with vegetable oil and sprinkled with salt. In 1970, this cost about 2 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 20 cents today. When the lard ran out, when the butter was gone, when the bacon grease was empty, there was cooking oil. You'd drizzle it on bread like salad dressing. Add salt. The oil soaked in and made the bread translucent and greasy. This was fat and sodium, basic fuel. Oil sandwiches disappeared because they were too depressing to admit. You can make them for about 25 cents today. Cornmeal mush fried sandwich. when cornmeal replaced bread. This was leftover cornmeal mush, sliced and fried, used instead of bread. In 1970, this cost about 4 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 30 cents today. Cornmeal mush was made by boiling cornmeal with water until thick. Pour it into a pan and let it set overnight. The next day, slice it and fry it in lard until crispy. Use the fried slices like bread. Put butter or jelly between them. This was Southern poverty food. Fried mush sandwiches disappeared when cornmeal mush became old-fashioned. You can make them for about 35 cents today, but cornmeal mush represents something deeper in Southern food culture, a connection to indigenous foodways, to enslaved people's survival strategies, to generations of rural poverty. Cornmeal was the cheapest grain available in the South for centuries. Wheat flour was expensive and had to be imported or milled from wheat that didn't grow well in Southern climates. Corn grew everywhere, thrived in Southern heat, and could be dried and ground into meal that lasted for months. For poor Southern families, cornmeal wasn't a choice. It was necessity. It was what you could afford. It was what kept you alive. The economics of cornmeal versus wheat flour were stark. In 1970, a 5-pound bag of cornmeal cost about 30 cents. A 5-pound bag of wheat flour cost about 60 cents, double the price. Cornmeal stretched further, too. It absorbed more water when cooked, expanding into greater volume. A cup of dry cornmeal made enough mush to feed 4 people for breakfast. A cup of flour made maybe 2 servings of biscuits. For families counting every penny, cornmeal was the obvious choice. It was cheaper per pound and went further per serving. Making cornmeal mush was simple but required attention. Bring water to a boil in a pot, about 4 cups of water for every cup of cornmeal. Add salt if you had it. Slowly pour cornmeal into the boiling water while stirring constantly. This was crucial. If you dumped the cornmeal in all at once, it would clump into lumps that never dissolved. You had to add it gradually, stirring the whole time, letting each addition incorporate before adding more. The mixture would thicken quickly. Keep stirring. The mush would bubble and spit, hot cornmeal exploding from the pot. You'd get burned if you weren't careful. Stir constantly for about 5 minutes until the mush was thick and smooth and pulled away from the sides of the pot. Serve it hot for breakfast. Some families ate it with butter and sugar. Others ate it with milk poured over it. Some ate it plain with just salt. It was filling and warm and tasted like corn, not sweet corn from the cob, but field corn. Starchy, bland, substantial. Children tolerated it. Adults appreciated that it was cheap and filling. Nobody loved it, but nobody starved either. The leftover mush was the key to making sandwiches. After breakfast, you'd pour the remaining mush into a loaf pan or any shallow pan. Smooth the top. Let it cool on the counter. Then put it in the refrigerator overnight. The mush would solidify as it cooled. The cornstarch in the cornmeal acted as a binder, turning the soft mush into a firm block that could be sliced. By morning, you had what looked like a loaf of yellow bread, dense, solid, sliceable. The next day, you'd turn the pan upside down and the mush block would slide out. Cut it into slices about 1/2 inch thick. Each slice was rectangular, yellow, and firm enough to handle. Heat lard in a cast-iron skillet. When the lard was hot and shimmering, place the mush slices in the pan. Don't crowd them. They needed space. The mush would sizzle immediately. Let it fry without moving it for about 3 to 4 minutes. The bottom would develop a golden brown crust. Flip it carefully with a spatula. Fry the other side until equally crispy. The result was slices that were crispy and golden on the outside, soft and warm on the inside. Use these fried slices like bread. The crispy exterior held together well enough to function as sandwich bread. Spread butter on one slice while it was still hot. The butter would melt into the crispy surface. Add jelly or jam if you had it. Place another fried slice on top. That was the sandwich. 2 pieces of fried cornmeal mush with butter and jelly between them. It looked strange, yellow instead of white, thicker than bread, with a texture that was simultaneously crispy and soft. But it worked. It was portable. It filled stomachs. It cost almost nothing. The taste was distinctly corn-forward, not sweet like cornbread, which had sugar and often eggs and milk. This was just corn, salt, and whatever fat you fried it in. The frying added richness. The crispy exterior added texture. The butter and jelly added sweetness and moisture. Together, they made something that wasn't bread, but served the same function. Children who ate these knew they were different from other kids' sandwiches. White bread sandwiches were normal. Fried cornmeal mush sandwiches marked you as poor, as rural, as Southern in ways that carried stigma. This was specifically Southern poverty food. Northern families didn't eat cornmeal mush regularly. It was survival food, yes, but it was also heritage. It was proof that your people had endured impossible circumstances and lived. That dual meaning, shame and pride, poverty and heritage, made cornmeal mush emotionally complicated. The process of frying the mush transformed it from poverty food to something more interesting. Fresh cornmeal mush was bland and mushy, barely tolerable. Fried cornmeal mush was crispy and flavorful, actually good. That transformation mattered. It showed that even with limited ingredients, you could make something better through technique and effort. Frying required fat, which cost money, and fuel, which cost money. But the improvement in taste and texture was worth it. It turned survival food into something children would actually eat without complaint. Fried mush sandwiches also showed the importance of leftovers in poverty cooking. You never made cornmeal mush specifically for sandwiches. You made it for breakfast because it was cheap. Then you used the leftovers creatively. This ethic of using everything, wasting nothing, maximizing every ingredient, that was essential to surviving poverty. Modern cooking culture often treats leftovers as optional or disposable. Poverty cooking treated leftovers as the foundation for the next meal. The disappearance of fried mush sandwiches happened as Southern foodways changed. Younger generations moved to cities, left the South, wanted to distance themselves from rural poverty. Cornmeal mush became old-fashioned, something only old people in the country still ate. Wheat bread became affordable and ubiquitous. Why eat fried cornmeal when you could have regular bread? The practical reason disappeared, and without necessity, the tradition faded. But some families kept making it. In rural Southern communities, especially black communities, cornmeal mush persisted as comfort food. Not because people were still poor, though many were, but because it was familiar, traditional, connected to family and history. The shame lifted somewhat as people reclaimed Southern food culture. Cornmeal mush became heritage food instead of just poverty food. That reframing mattered. It allowed people to eat traditional foods without feeling ashamed. The nutritional value of cornmeal mush was decent. Cornmeal had carbohydrates for energy, some protein, B vitamins, and iron if it was enriched. It wasn't complete nutrition, but it was better than white bread. The frying added fat and calories. The butter and jelly added more calories and some vitamins from the fruit in the jelly. Together, they made a meal that provided energy to get through the day. Not optimal nutrition, but adequate for survival. Children who ate fried mush sandwiches often had mixed feelings about them as adults. Some refused to eat cornmeal in any form. The association with poverty was too strong. Others sought it out, made it for their own families, taught their children how to make it. The difference often came down to whether they'd processed the poverty and shame or were still carrying it. Those who'd made peace with their past could eat cornmeal without emotional baggage. Those who hadn't still felt the sting of being the poor kid with the weird sandwich. The regional pride around Southern food has helped rehabilitate cornmeal dishes. Grits became trendy in upscale restaurants. Cornbread became artisanal. Even cornmeal mush, rebranded as polenta when made with Italian-style cornmeal, became acceptable in foodie culture. This gentrification of poverty food is complicated. It's good that traditional foods are valued again, But it's problematic when the people who originally ate them out of necessity can't afford the fancy restaurant versions. Fried mush sandwiches at home cost 35 cents. Polenta at a restaurant costs $15. Same food, different context, wildly different price. You can make fried mush sandwiches today for about 35 cents. Cornmeal costs about $3 for a 5-pound bag. That bag makes dozens of batches. Lard costs about $3 per container. One batch of mush uses maybe 10 cents worth of cornmeal and 5 cents worth of lard. Add butter and jelly, and you're at 35 cents for a filling sandwich. That's still incredibly cheap, but you probably won't make them unless you're curious about food history or connecting with family tradition. They're not better than bread. They're just different. A window into how people ate when bread was too expensive and cornmeal was what you had. Canned milk sandwich, when fresh milk was impossible. This was white bread soaked in evaporated milk from a can. In 1970, this cost about 5 cents per sandwich. That's roughly 40 cents today. A can of evaporated milk cost 30 cents and didn't require refrigeration. When there was no fresh milk, you used canned. Pour it in a bowl, tear bread into pieces, soak until soft. Add sugar if you had it. Eat with a spoon. This was dairy and carbohydrates. Canned milk sandwiches disappeared when refrigeration became universal. You can make them for about 45 cents today, but there's a deeper story here about what canned milk represented in working-class households. Evaporated milk was a marvel of food technology. Milk that didn't spoil, didn't need ice, could sit on a shelf for months. For families without reliable refrigeration, or families whose refrigerators were so old they barely kept anything cold, canned milk was security. It meant you always had milk, even when the fresh milk went sour, even when you couldn't afford to buy fresh milk every few days. This security mattered more than taste or nutrition. Knowing you had something to feed your children tomorrow was worth the metallic flavor and thick texture of evaporated milk. The economics of canned milk were complicated. Fresh milk cost about 50 cents per gallon in 1970. A gallon lasted maybe 3 to 4 days for a family with children. A can of evaporated milk cost 30 cents and, when reconstituted with water, made about 3 cups. So, evaporated milk was actually more expensive per ounce than fresh milk. But poor families didn't calculate that way. They thought about waste, spoilage, and the cost of keeping a refrigerator running. Fresh milk spoiled if you didn't drink it fast enough. Wasting food was unthinkable when money was tight. Canned milk never spoiled. You opened it, used what you needed, and it lasted for days in the refrigerator after opening. The higher per-ounce cost was offset by zero waste. Canned milk sandwiches, or more accurately, canned milk bread soup, were what you made when there was nothing else for breakfast or lunch. The process was simple and depressing. Open a can of evaporated milk. The milk would be thick, yellowish-white, and smell slightly cooked. Pour it into a bowl. The milk was too thick to drink straight. It needed water for drinking. But for bread soup, you used it undiluted or only slightly thinned. Tear white bread into rough pieces, not neat cubes like croutons, just torn chunks. Drop them into the milk. The bread would float at first, then slowly absorb the liquid and sink. Stir it occasionally. Wait 5 minutes. The bread would become completely saturated, falling apart if you stirred too hard. If you had sugar, you'd add a spoonful or two. The sugar dissolved into the milk and transformed the taste from institutional to almost dessert-like. Some families added vanilla extract if they had it. Vanilla was cheap and lasted forever. A few drops made the difference between eating sadness and eating something that resembled bread pudding. But most families ate it plain, just bread, milk, and maybe sugar, nothing more. The texture was the hardest part for children. The bread became slimy and fell apart on the spoon. It wasn't liquid, wasn't solid, it was paste. Kids gagged on it, complained, refused to eat it. Mothers insisted, "It's food. Eat it or go hungry." Most kids ate it. Going hungry was worse. They'd force down spoonfuls of soggy bread, trying not to think about the texture, trying not to taste it too much. Some kids held their noses while eating. Others ate it as fast as possible to get it over with. The taste was bland with a slightly caramelized flavor from the evaporated milk. Fresh milk tastes bright and clean. Evaporated milk tastes cooked, darker, with a faint metallic note from the can. Some people liked that flavor. Most tolerated it. It was milk, and milk was supposed to be good for you, and that's what mattered when you were poor. Nutrition trumped preference. Survival trumped taste. Canned milk sandwiches represented a specific kind of poverty, the kind where you had some resources but not enough. You had bread, you had canned milk, you had a roof and a bowl, but you didn't have fresh food, variety, or abundance. You were surviving, not thriving. You were one step above having nothing, but several steps below having enough. This middle ground of poverty was common and invisible. Families looked okay from the outside. They had homes, clothes, children in school. But inside those homes, they were eating bread soaked in canned milk because that's what they could afford. The shame around canned milk sandwiches was different from the shame around obviously desperate foods like lard bread or vinegar sandwiches. Those were clearly poverty food. Canned milk sandwiches looked almost normal. Bread and milk are both legitimate foods. But the way you ate them revealed the desperation. Tearing bread into pieces and soaking it in milk was how you fed babies and toddlers who couldn't chew yet. Eating this way as a school-age child felt infantilizing. It felt like regression, like you couldn't even afford to eat like a normal person. Some families tried to make it more acceptable by calling it something else. Milk toast sounded better than bread soup. Some called it poor man's bread pudding, though real bread pudding was baked with eggs and spices and actually tasted good. These euphemisms didn't change what it was, but they made it easier to serve and easier to eat. Language could soften reality, at least a little. Children who ate canned milk sandwiches learned to hide it. They'd eat before school so classmates wouldn't see. They'd lie about breakfast if anyone asked. They'd skip breakfast entirely rather than admit what they were eating. This constant hiding, this vigilance about keeping poverty secret, took a psychological toll. Children internalized the message that their poverty was shameful, that it made them less than other kids, that it was something to hide at all costs. Parents felt different shame. Mothers who served this to their children knew it wasn't adequate. They knew their kids deserved better, but they were doing the best they could with what they had. The shame was about perceived failure, feeling like they'd failed as providers, failed as mothers, failed to protect their children from hunger. That shame was heavy and persistent. It didn't matter that poverty was caused by low wages and economic systems. It felt personal. It felt like their fault. The disappearance of canned milk sandwiches happened gradually through the 1980s and 1990s. Refrigeration became more reliable and universal. Wages slowly increased for some families. Food assistance programs expanded. Fewer families faced the desperate poverty that required eating bread soaked in canned milk. By the 2000s, this had become a relic, something grandparents remembered but didn't discuss. But the memory lingered in those who'd eaten it. Some adults developed complicated relationships with evaporated milk. They couldn't stand the smell and refused to keep it in their homes. Others kept cans in the pantry as security, a reminder they'd survived hard times. Some became obsessive about never wasting food. Others spent freely on groceries, never wanting to feel that deprivation again. The childhood experience of eating poverty food shaped adult relationships with food and money in lasting ways. You can make canned milk sandwiches today for about 45 cents. Evaporated milk costs about $2 per can. White bread costs about $2 per loaf. But you shouldn't make them unless you want to understand what poverty tasted like. They're not good. They're not interesting. They're just sad food that kept people alive when there was nothing else. That's their only value, historical and educational. They show what survival looked like when money ran out, but hunger remained. 30 sandwiches from working-class kitchens in the 1970s. Everyone kept families fed when money was tight. Everyone cost under 15 cents. Everyone disappeared when people had enough money to forget they'd ever been this poor. These weren't recipes from cookbooks. They were survival. Lard on bread, crackers and milk, vinegar and salt. Your grandmother made these when there was nothing else. They cost almost nothing and kept empty stomachs full until the next meal. We don't make these anymore because we don't have to, and that's a good thing. But remembering them matters. These sandwiches are proof that people survived hard times with creativity and determination. They're proof that poverty doesn't mean giving up. It means making do. Let me know in the comments if your family ate any of these. And if you want more forgotten recipes from the 1970s, I'll see you in the next video.